I was recently asked to do a video about the Shroud of Turin. I try my best to make videos that people are interested in, so here it is. I will also mention Joseph Campbell because he made a video about the Shroud of Turin. In his video, he mentions Isaiah 52:13 in relation to the Shroud of Turin. This doesn't make sense for two reasons. I'm not a biblical scholar, but we know from the context surrounding this verse that it is not Jesus that is being talked about, but rather the people of Jerusalem being the servant of Yahweh. The text I am showing you is a translation of the Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. You probably already know that the Dead Sea Scrolls are among the earliest biblical texts we have. So this verse does not mention Jesus by name, nor does it mention a Messiah or someone who has been crucified. Mentioning this verse in relation to the Shroud of Turin being authentic would not make sense either, because if Jesus really was unrecognizable like the servant of Yahweh mentioned, there would be no clear face imprint on the shroud itself. The Bible does not mention any image of Jesus' face being imprinted on the burial shroud. The authors of the Bible always mention notable miracles that Jesus is said to have done. Therefore, if the author's behavior is consistent, and they are not making special exceptions to exclude certain miracles, then they would also mention physical evidence of a miracle like the Shroud of Turin. We can reason that either the biblical authors are not being consistent in their documentation of miracles, or they did not know about the Shroud of Turin. One of the strange things about the Shroud of Turin is that the left arm of the image is 7 to 10 centimeters longer than the right arm. It was determined with direct forensic techniques that trauma, even if it included shoulder dislocation, elbow dislocation, and wrist dislocation, could not cause an arm to stretch to this length. The conclusions from this scientific paper is that an exaggerated arm length and implausible body position support the theory that the shroud is a deliberate forgery. In Joseph Campbell's video, he talks about radiocarbon dating that was done to the shroud. He states that the radiocarbon process does give accurate results, but he believes they took samples from the newer repairs instead of the older parts of the shroud. He also mentions a scientific paper that uses wide-angle X-ray scattering as a way of trying to date the shroud. The paper concludes that the experimental results are compatible with the hypothesis that the shroud is a 2,000-year-old relic. The results are considered to be experimental because this method has not been shown to be definitively accurate. This method is based on the assumption that the shroud was kept at specific temperature and humidity levels. Basing conclusions off this assumption is not a particularly good idea because we don't know the temperature and humidity that the shroud was kept at for a significant amount of time. The X-ray dating method was applied to a sample that was in the same proximity as the radiocarbon dating results were in. So if the radiocarbon dated results were accurate, we would expect that the X-ray method to give similar results if the area was in fact a repaired area. More importantly, another scientific paper that investigated the fiber samples from the shroud found that there isn't any evidence that the radiocarbon dated sample came from a non-original repaired section. This leads us to the conclusion that the radiocarbon dating results were definitely accurate and the shroud was made, in fact, sometime around 1260 to 1390 Common Era. There is a scientific paper that explains how a medieval artist could use simple techniques to create the shroud. Unfortunately, I can read only the summary and not the whole thing. However, we have an explanation of the techniques used from a Reuters interview with the scientist himself. They placed a linen sheet over a volunteer and then rubbed it with a pigment containing traces of acid. A mask was used for the face. The pigment was then artificially aged by heating the cloth in an oven and then washing it, which removed the pigment. With this method, they successfully recreated the sort of effect that is seen on the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is in a category of artwork that is labeled by a Greek term that I won't try to pronounce. This term refers to items that are believed to have been made by non-human beings. As far as we know, the Shroud of Turin had its first recorded appearance sometime in the middle of the 14th century. This would support the radiocarbon dating estimate that it was made in the Middle Ages. In conclusion, the Shroud of Turin is a forged item. Its existence is definitely not evidence that Christianity is true or that Jesus rose from the dead. Since I'm addressing biblical topics, I wanted to mention some other things. The text I'm showing you is Mark 16 from BibleGateway.com, and I have highlighted some interesting points. First of all, we have Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of James, who are going to the tomb where Jesus' body has been laid. When they got there, they saw that the tomb was empty and they met a young man sitting there, and for some reason they became alarmed. We don't have a good reason why they should flee the scene, trembling and bewildered, as the young man explained what was going on and said specifically that they shouldn't be alarmed as he sat there peacefully. The original ending for Mark is that the two women are fleeing and they don't tell anyone because they were afraid. The superficial conclusion that some people have made from this ending is that it doesn't make sense because how could the story continue if the women didn't tell it? The Steelman argument against this is that the young man himself could have obviously related this series of events to others. So the earliest manuscripts did not have the additional parts of Mark that were added later. There was some variations in the endings that were added later as well. I want you to just hold on to that thought because I'm going to explain why there are different endings later. You need to see this first. It's Matthew's account of the same event. In this version, the two Marys see not a young man, but an angel open the tomb and sit on the stone. This version of events is obviously more terrifying, so we have an actual reason for the two women to be frightened. In this video, James Tabor explains that the reason that other authors decided to add different endings to the original version of Mark is because of criticism. Critics were making the argument that Mark wasn't very convincing. After all, nobody actually interacted with a resurrected Jesus who had a physical body. Consequently, stories were made that supported the narrative of a Jesus that was so obviously physical that he could sit and eat with his disciples. Tabor goes on to explain that the early Christian understanding of Jesus' resurrection was one that involved Jesus having a new spiritual body and not a physical one. The alternate endings to Mark are considerably problematic to modern Christians because they demonstrate that the documents that eventually became the Bible were being actively changed very early on. The embellishment and modification of the story that Matthew did by turning the young man into a frightening angel shows how the evolution of such stories continues as time progresses. Likewise, each writer has the ability to take creative liberty in his version of the story and can still be considered canon. I was raised Catholic, so I didn't know until recently that Protestants were ultimately responsible for 7 books being removed from the biblical canon. It is ultimately men who decide what they believe to be the Word of God. Consequently, there is some disagreement about what should be considered canon because of a lack of divine intervention on the matter. For example, the Book of Enoch is only considered to be canon by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, yet the New Testament author Jude considers Enoch to be credible. This causes a bit of a problem for churches to hold a position that directly contradicts a biblical author that they hold to be divinely inspired. Another biblical author, Peter, has a verse about spiritual prisoners that is obviously drawn from Enoch. You can obviously see why churches don't want to accept Enoch as canon from this quote, because it states that spirits are being constantly tortured in heaven as punishment for disobeying God. When Peter and Jude both mention disobedient angels being bound in chains and kept in darkness, this is clearly drawn from the Book of Enoch. Again, if we hold Jude and Peter to be correct, then we would also have to accept that their views about chained angels are correct, even if those views come from a source that most churches do not accept. If we reject the source of Jude and Peter's beliefs about chained angels, then we have to admit that Jude and Peter certainly weren't divinely inspired in all of their biblical writings. Another important point is brought up by the Dead Sea Scrolls expert Kip Davis in an interview. He mentions that a significant part of the Bible is written in Aramaic in a way that it appears that the authors took older stories written in Aramaic and created a Hebrew introduction to combine the two in a way that made narrative sense. The theme of using parts of older stories is very obvious when we compare the older Epic of Gilgamesh to Genesis. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a man who built a boat to escape a flood that was divine punishment for what the humans were doing wrong. This is like the Noah story of Genesis. Both of these stories involve the main character who survived a flood, and then he went on to set a dove out after 7 days. Likewise, both sent out a raven. However, I should also mention that the flood myth likely comes from an even older story, the Atrahasis epic. Perhaps most importantly, both Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh both mention that there is a firmament in the heavens. This detail demonstrates the mythological nature of these stories, as there is no firmament or solid barrier that is in the sky above us. Whenever we start looking back at history, there is a chance that we will find answers that disprove our beliefs. Modern versions of the Bible obviously don't give us the older historical perspective that we need. When we look back, we find that the Bible describes that the God that is responsible for freeing the Israelites from Egypt, he is referred to as El, and has horns like a wild ox. It seems that El was the original God that was associated with the Exodus, and when he was combined with Yahweh, Yahweh naturally had to take credit for this event. Logically, El can't be the same God that created us in his image, or we would have horns as well. Many people are familiar with the story of Lucifer and his fall. Lucifer is not actually the name of this being, it's just a word that means morning star or dawn star. Looking back at the Ugaritic texts, we find that the story originally referred to a god named Atra, who was called the morning star. The reason that Atra was cast down was because it was punishment for trying to become the head of the pantheon. Who was in charge at the pantheon at that point is actually Baal. Baal is the enemy of Yahweh. The reason why Atra thought he could rule the pantheon was because the previous head, Baal, was killed. Unfortunately for Atra, Baal was resurrected from the dead. Atra, while a god in his own right and the son of El and Asherah, did not have the power and ability to become the head of the pantheon. You already know about another son of El and Asherah because his name is Yahweh. Elyon means Most High. El and Elyon are two names for the same God who is the father of Yahweh. As the highlighted quote states, when the Most High allotted peoples for inheritance, he fixed the boundaries for peoples according to his divine sons. So Yahweh's portion is his people, and Jacob is Yahweh's inheritance. From a mythological standpoint, since Atra is one of those sons and is also the brother of Yahweh, he would also inherit some people. However, since Christianity has its own version of mythology that supersedes previous ones, Atra becomes a fallen angel known as Lucifer. Likewise, all other gods that are not Yahweh are downgraded to demons. Finally, my favorite part of Christian mythology is in the Book of Enoch. It involves fallen angels teaching various things to mankind, and of course we are supposed to conclude that these things are inherently bad. This includes the observation of stars, the study of astronomy, and the creation of mirrors. This is the sort of thing that illustrates that Yahweh desires to keep humans from learning all sorts of useful information. Now you understand why Yahweh wanted to keep humans from eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and losing their ignorance. The fruit should really be called the fruit of enlightenment because Adam and Eve gained self-awareness after eating it. You can tell that this is the case because they understood that they were unclothed after eating it. Enlightenment was only sinful because Yahweh wanted us to be ignorant. Because of superstitious Christian beliefs and the prioritization of faith over the advancement of science, the Middle Ages were defined by magnificent cathedrals and rampant pestilence. This is the absolute epitome of misplaced priorities on the part of humankind, and the demonstration that no matter if an entire society prays and follows church doctrine, God will not cure our illnesses nor lessen the suffering of the dying. Thankfully, we have developed medicine that does these things. In spite of Christianity and its beliefs about the paranormal origins of diseases, we have brought about the Age of Enlightenment.